Welcome to A Slice of SEL, a podcast for educators about social emotional learning.
Hey guys, welcome to the first episode of A Slice of SEL, a podcast from the St. Croix River Education District.
I am Courtney Strelo. I am the Social Behavior Services Coordinator for Chisago Lakes and North Branch. For the most part, our role as Social Behavior Services Coordinators is working with special education teachers, providing individual support on student cases.
And I'm Rye Boostrom. I am also a Social Behavior Services Coordinator, mirroring Courtney's role, except for the northern side of our districts, including Rush City, Pine City, Hinckley, Finlayson, and East Central schools.
And I'm Nick Van Oss. I'm an SEL Services Coordinator. We're actually all part of the SEL Services team. We just have slightly different roles. I serve all 6 districts, which comes out to about 19 buildings. And I work more at the core school-wide level versus the individual student level.
The reason we are here doing this podcast is because we are currently in a pandemic, and it was just a kind of a perfect opportunity to be able to share information in more of a slow drip type way with the districts we support, just giving them a little bit of information at once versus having professional learning days where we give a bunch of information at one time.
Yeah, and we're terrified. We've never done a podcast before. We've recorded a bunch of videos together, but for some reason, when you put the word podcast attached to it, it becomes a lot more intimidating.
It feels a lot more official.
Yeah.
Serious.
It reminds me of a friend of mine, John Brown, from high school. We were in a band together, and he was a great guitar player, but whenever it was time for him to do a guitar solo when we performed, he would always turn around and face his amplifier instead of the crowd. That's how I feel right now.
Right. Something about the video going is just a little intimidating.
The video definitely makes it.
Well, today's episode, we're going to talk about team norms, otherwise known as community agreements. You may have heard like different labels for this. I think it's essentially the same concept. It's kind of the team coming together, hopefully early in the process, and agreeing on kind of like our compass, like what are we going to agree to, how are we going to act around each other, what is our process going to look like so that we have a welcoming, productive team and a team that people actually enjoy being a part of. And, usually you might be thinking like, this is called a slice of SEL. Not that you are thinking this, but some people, when they hear SEL, automatically think of curriculum and a teacher standing in front of a class and maybe teaching belly breathing or something else. That's certainly part of social emotional learning, but there's a lot to social emotional learning, more than we're going to go to in our first episode. But a big part of SEL is adult SEL, and we're all lifelong learners. So the things that we're teaching our students about teamwork, for example, and relationship building and maintenance also apply to us. And none of us are perfect. I'm certainly not. So team norms, community agreements are there for a reason, because left to our own devices, if we don't have that team communication about what we're trying to do for each other to support each other as a team, I've certainly had team experiences that weren't as enjoyable as others, and team norms are a good way to support having a better team process. But before we get into that, Rye's going to talk us through a segment that we're going to try and do called What's Filling Your Bucket?
Yeah, so SEL obviously is important. And when we talk about SEL, you often will hear terms like self-management and self-awareness. So we're trying to incorporate what's filling your bucket into this podcast. And what does that mean? So filling your bucket means that you are doing things that are making others feel good, and they can be big, they can be small acts or gestures, or even just saying you look great today. How's it going? Checking in with that person. But also by doing things and filling other people's buckets, we also get our own buckets filled as well, because it feels good to do good for others. For example, recently I was in the Caribou line, and the person in front of me paid for my drink. And gosh, that made me feel so good. It just was like a great start to the day. And then in turn, I thought about the person behind me and I paid for the drink behind me. So like I paid it forward, and I realized that that act that I did to that person made me feel equally as good to the person that did it before me. So Nick, what's filling your bucket today?
What's filling my bucket is North Branch Area High School. They have a great PBIS team, and what is really cool about it is that they have peer leaders, so student leaders that are part of that team, which is something that's especially helpful, especially with like middle and high school PBIS teams, to have that student voice. And their faculty advisors asked for nominations for new peer leaders this fall, and they got, I think, 35. I'll feel bad if I got that wrong, but I'm pretty sure it was 35 nominations, and they already have a really robust team of returning students. So props to them. That's
amazing. Good job, North Branch.
Courtney, what's filling your bucket?
Recently, I have become an aunt, I think, to a adorable pug named Ruthie. She is like 6-7 weeks old. She's just the cutest thing in the world. And I've just been able to be doggy daycare the last couple of days, and it's just making me feel so awesome. Something about just like seeing her be innocent and running around and jumping and not really knowing how to use her legs is just, I don't know, awesome. She's so adorable, and it's just definitely filled my bucket this week for sure.
She is adorable. She was adorably chewing on your sleeve before we started recording.
She was. Also yesterday, my grandpa, who's like this gigantic man, was laying on the floor with her, this hardwood floor, and like cuddling with her and playing with her with his hands, and she bit his ear so hard she like went through, so he was like bleeding from the ear. But she's something else. We gotta get those bites under control, but gosh, she's cute.
Well, transitioning back to team norms and community agreements, speaking of PBIS and North Branch Area High School's PBIS team, I kind of see norms and community agreements as very, very similar. And it's important to have, just like PBIS expectations, you want kind of like a short, comprehensive, and by comprehensive, you want kind of like short phrases that cover a lot, because what you don't want is like a laundry list of like 30 different things, negatively phrased, like don't do this, we don't do this, we don't do this, like we don't bring caribou to the meeting, we don't wear Packers jerseys to the meetings, just coming up with some silly examples. But if we have a team and we have like 30 different things and they're all like no-nos, no one's going to really remember those. It's too much, and they're not going to cover everything. So with team norms, we try and get like a relatively short list that people can actually remember, and it's easy to it doesn't take forever to run through them. So they can actually become like a meaningful part of the meeting that we revisit often, we talk about. And yeah, they should be comprehensive. They should cover a lot. And you might be thinking like, well, that's great to talk about, but like, how do we do that? And when I was first learning about like classroom rules and PBIS, like the examples were really helpful. So during this podcast, we will be giving some examples and some tools to help your teams set up their norms and community agreements for the year. I know on teams that I've been on, we talk a lot about psychological safety. That's kind of the idea that you're in a team that you trust and you can take risks. So if you're concerned about an idea, for example, you can raise that concern and you won't feel like you're kind of getting like dagger looks, and people are being really judgmental. Like people want the rest of the team to speak up. They'd rather have things be shared respectfully than remain unsaid. So just an example, like a team like that is going to be just better and more productive because you won't have kind of like side conversations before and after the meeting because people were too scared to say what they were thinking during the meeting. So norms are just so crucial for things like that. And we're going to talk about like, how do we establish team norms? And now I'm going to do something that Rye teases me about, and I'm going to share my screen.
Talking about psychological safety, right, Nick?
I think it's important to have a healthy little bit of teasing going on in a group. Otherwise, are we really psychologically safe?
That is true. Can you guys see the right screen?
We can.
Okay. Well, I'm on the Cross District SEL website, and you know, here's a tip. It's linked in a couple places, but if you want to get right there, you can type tinyurl.com/SEL site. And that brings you to this cross-district SEL website. I want something that applies to everyone. I'm going to go up to educators in the top menu, click SEL Toolkits. And because this applies to everyone, it's universal. I'm going to open our universal SEL Toolkit.
You might be wondering, why are we sharing our screen and going through all this, and this is a podcast? Well, it's also a YouTube video, so we are doing both auditory and visual learning here. So we'll try to be as descriptive as possible when we're showing our screens.
Oh, you're like a seasoned podcaster already, Courtney.
Thanks.
I scrolled down to Educator SEL, and we're talking about modeling and collaboration. So how are we modeling our SEL skills? How are we collaborating effectively? And I'm going to jump into a link that says resource folder. And I want team norms and community agreements. So I'm going to click on that little subfolder. And now I've got a couple of documents. And Courtney's going to talk about, never mind, Rye's going to talk about a process for setting community agreements.
Yeah, so the first step of establishing norms or community agreements is to just think about teams that you've been on, teams that you really liked or maybe even disliked, and then use some of those traits and frame some of those norm and agreements positively. So for me, I really hate when meetings go over time. So starting and ending a meeting on time is a norm agreement that I really like to see on agendas with teams that I work with. And I just try to, you know, emphasize that starting and ending the meeting on time is important, because we're all busy and we all have other things that are pulling our attention, and sticking to the agenda is another one. So Courtney.
Well, and before Courtney takes over, what we are looking at on the YouTube video version of the podcast is there's an article that walks through what Rye was just describing, kind of that process of like, hey, let's talk about the worst team we've ever been on. Like, what are a couple things that made it that way? Talk about the best team we've ever been on. What are a couple things that made it that way? And then use that to carve out our team norms. So there is an article that expands on that. And Courtney, you were going to talk about this survey.
So we also want to talk about, like, how do we get the input from our team members so that we know what we need to have in our norms? Like, is this just a conversation we have? But one of the resources that we have through our organization is the survey that was created by Angela Christensen, and she is a school psych at the Chisago Lakes High School. She's a rock star. So this survey just kind of goes over a list of like choices of norms, and then just has people select their top 3. And then I'm sure since it's a Google form, it populates into a Excel sheet or a spreadsheet so that you can just kind of see where the most common ones are and then go from there. Is there any other pages on there, Nick?
No, just a couple, open-ended comment
yeah,
boxes.
Additional feedback, like if there's something that wasn't listed on there that you're really passionate about, making sure that you give people the opportunity to include those. And then, like, how are you going to hold the group to their norms? Like, are there suggestions that people within the group have to keeping everybody following those norms and making sure that the group is doing what they agreed to do from the start?
And on this survey, we do have a great succinct list, kind of what we were talking about earlier, like what are some examples? So start and end on time is one. Be fully present and engaged mentally and physically is another. You could make that more explicit. Some people actually will write like laptops, please be closed. Speak from the heart. So tell your truth while using a social filter. So it's all about finding a balance of like, you know, we really want to hear what people are thinking, make people feel safe so that they can say what they're thinking. We also have to be respectful to each other. So, you know, if I'm, you know, speaking from the heart and it's, you know, using really mean words to talk about Rye, that's not really using a social filter or being respectful. So there's a balance to these things. So that's just a couple, but we have a list of about 10 that, like we said, Angela Christensen collected, and they're really great starting points. And we've talked about really two ways so far of setting up your norms. One is kind of that discussion that Rye talked about, where like as a group, you might talk about the worst teams, the best teams. The survey is nice because it gives you potentially like anonymity. You can hear what everyone wants without having everyone need to speak up in front of all of their peers. And that can be really nice because we all have different voices with different volumes, and some people are a little quieter, and they might go for a long time in a team without saying what's bothering them or what they need from the team. So a survey like this gives everyone the same opportunity without having to speak up to let the facilitator know what they need.
Yeah, I probably could have gone an entire year last year, my first year working here, without saying a thing in a meeting. My voice was, I found, very quiet when I'm starting out, but finding it again. But that's just really important for those people who either are new to a team or just don't feel comfortable speaking out.
Yeah, and having multiple choice, because, can't say that enough. Like if you just asked me point blank, especially if you're new to a team or to an organization, like what are some things that you think we should be doing as a team? I have to come up with the words on my own. I might be worried about people like judging what my contributions are. So giving some options that people can just pick from, I think is nice too. And it just makes it potentially faster, because we've all been in those meetings where it's like, this meeting is scheduled to start at 7 o'clock in the morning. I can barely come up with any words right now. It might just take a long time, or feel like it's taking a long time to just feel like we're coming up with norms from scratch. This doesn't have to be a long process. Like you can knock this out in like 5 minutes if you do like that survey thing, maybe even less. Next, we're going to talk about like, how do we hold those norms? I like that language. Like, how do we hold to those norms? We're pulling up an example agenda, which is in the same folder we were looking at. And we won't go into everything that's on this agenda, but this mimics what Courtney and Rye and a team that we have around SEL at Scred actually use. And it gives you space to just paste your norms at the beginning of each meeting agenda. So every time we meet, which is once a week in the case of this team, we'll just quickly read through our norms to just make them fresh in everybody's mind. Which again, that's kind of why it's important to try and have like a succinct, comprehensive, short little list, because if it takes us a long time to read through really long norms, a lot of them, it's going to be harder to make it part of our day-to-day process. So putting them on the meeting agenda you're using and just making sure you're revisiting them consistently is a good way to like, kind of just the way we would with our students, like, we're about to do seat work. Let's remember to be respectful and keep our voices quiet. Honestly, it's the same thing for us. Like we need that reminder, maybe to close our laptop and remind ourselves to be present. Like I know I need that all the time before meetings, because adults have a lot going on.
I definitely need that, especially right now with us working from home the majority of the time. I'm really struggling with that on task.
Yeah, and we talk about with PBIS and with pre-teaching and preventive prompting, like it's really nice. You're being kind to your students by giving them that heads up and that reminder about what you're looking for. And if I'm the facilitator, I'd rather be giving my team that reminder of like, hey, let's be present. Can we please like set things aside? Whatever your team norms are, like giving people that grace and that reminder of them versus having to worry about addressing it when people are breaking the norms. Like it's a lot easier to be proactive than reactive, and it feels a lot better, especially with adults, because a lot of adults really don't like that confrontation and that feeling like I messed up, and now like it feels really confrontational if we're talking about norms. And I think, Courtney, you were going to talk about a cool practice that our director of special education uses to keep checking on our norms.
I am. So one thing that we do at the end of every meeting that we have for not only services coordination, which is one group that we meet with, and then also our implementation team meeting, is our director has this survey that checks on team norms. It lists all of the norms that we have in our meetings, and then we reflect and we self-reflect on how we thought it went for us that day. And then we're able to provide feedback on like, well, we noticed, for example, that we went 5 minutes over on just about every topic, and that was really hard for me to follow along. And so you're able to like give that feedback immediately after. And then another important piece of that is that at the start of the next meeting, we reflect like on what the feedback was, so that we're all able to go, oh yeah, that was tough, and then kind of come up with a plan for how we're going to make sure that that doesn't happen again, or we can remedy whatever those broken norms were.
And I think that's a really, really nice process, because again, thinking of the quieter voices and how a lot of us, we live in Minnesota, don't like direct confrontation. So calling people out directly in the meeting feels really aggressive. Like just, yeah, like, you know, looking at someone and saying like, hey, you know, Rye, you've been staring at that computer screen an awful lot. Like that kind of direct call out feels really aggressive. Maybe not in Jersey, my Jersey friends from grad school, but in Minnesota it does. So having this kind of built-in routine for checking on how are we doing and allowing people to share is really nice. And then the facilitator can navigate it, like they can approach people one-on-one, which feels less aggressive. And it's a nicer way to address things. I forgot we were going to talk about as you're going through your agenda, and I talked about how good it is to, like, before every meeting, revisit your norms. Rye was going to talk about another thing we do to kind of during the meeting help with us holding our norms.
Yeah, so we kind of already talked about it a little bit, but just we haven't given it a defined term. So one thing that's super helpful that I think that we've kind of adopted this year, especially at our meetings through Scred, is when we assign team roles, one of those roles is being a process observer, which is just a fancy word for being like a norm supervisor. So this role just normalizes the idea that someone is supposed to speak up when a norm is broken. So when the discussion kind of leads down a rabbit hole and one of the norms is, you know, sticking to the topic, that process observer or norm supervisor can, you know, speak up and say, hey guys, we're kind of off topic. Let's get back to the agenda. Or, you know, like Courtney said, when we're 5 minutes over on each topic, that process observer just, you know, speaks up and says, hey, time's up, you guys, we gotta keep moving. I think it's just a really good practice. And we'll talk about some more roles in another episode coming up, but I think the process observer is a good one to talk about when we talk about norms.
Yeah, so I think the general theme here, and we're wrapping things up, is like rituals and routines. We use that phrase a lot with students, but again, like we're lifelong learners. None of us are perfect. So not winging it as a team, but putting some structures in place. Well, it does take a little bit of time. With these tools we're providing you, it really cuts down on that time, and you don't have to like Google things and search the internet yourself. There's some really good examples here that a lot of people have put time into. But having those rituals and routines and those structures in place is going to save you time in the long run, because we won't have ineffective teams where, again, people are frustrated with each other, don't feel like they have a way to speak up. We have people engaging in behavior that's bothering other people, and other people are afraid to let them know. Like, you can avoid a lot of drama and frustration in your team, and just make it a better place to be if you invest in those norms and those community agreements, because they're kind of like the compass. We're going to go through some takeaways here. You know, the norms, community agreements are kind of like a compass. Like, where do we want to go as a team? What do we want to be? If we want to be productive and welcoming to everyone here, what do we need to do to achieve that? And it doesn't take a lot of time to establish these. So like we went through, one way to do it is to have a conversation about the worst team you've been on, then the best team you've been on, and then kind of carve out a couple of norms agreements. Another way would be to just use that Google survey and share it with your team, and then use those results. Maybe at the next meeting you propose, like, you know, these are the ones that everyone voted for. Do we feel good about those? And then you move on. You know, it's a really quick interaction. And actually holding those norms is then the difficult ongoing work. And a couple ways to do that is to actually physically like put them on your agenda you're using so that you're prompted and reminded to go through them quickly before each meeting. And then if you have a process observer, it normalizes that job of speaking up when someone isn't holding a norm. And then finally, using some kind of a check and a survey, again, is a really nice anonymous way to let those quieter voices be heard. Having a routine check of how are we holding our norms or not, and like what suggestions do you have for what we can change. You don't have to do all those things I just listed. We do in a variety of teams. We don't do all of those things for every team that we're on, but hopefully it gives you some ideas for how to put those norms in place and have them actually work for you.
Yeah, so great job today, guys. We just wanted to thank you on behalf of the Scred SEL team for sticking with us and spending time with us today. If you're tuning in via YouTube, make sure that you subscribe so that you're notified when new episodes are released each week. And when you come back, we'll see you next time on another slice of SEL.
Thanks, guys. Bye.